So, Lindsey, you wrote a great report. What do you want us to take away from this today? How should we feel at the end of this meeting? Should we be happy or depressed?
Yeah. Well, I would also add to Corey's bio that he has been deemed the most effective advocate for school choice since Milton Friedman. So probably one of the most important components of your bio. But yeah, I would say that you should feel extremely optimistic. I am an optimist, but truly, and particularly depending on how things go, let's say November and a few months after that, I mean, we are seeing more at the state level in terms of choice than we've ever seen, but there's also more of an appetite to actually devolve and eliminate the federal Department of Ed than we've ever seen before. And we have a serious roadmap for how to accomplish that. So I feel extremely optimistic that we actually have a shot at, if not fully devolving it, right-sizing it to a pretty great extent. So I would say optimistic is the key word.
I remember one of your quotes at one of your congressional testimonies. What was it? It was one word, and it went viral on social media when they said, "What do you support the Federal Department of Education?"
I think it said devolve it.
Dissolve it or something.
Yeah,
get rid of it.
Yeah,
it was
exactly.
great. It was the perfect response, very quick. So speaking of November, when Trump wins, what do you think he should do? What are his day ones when it comes to education? And what are other policies that he should advocate for if he were to become president?
Well, look, I mean, I don't have to tell everybody in this room that education is a quintessentially state and local issue, right? I mean, it is, if you just look at federal K-12 education financing, we're only talking about 8.5% of overall K-12 revenue, right, is from the federal government. So there's very little you can or should try to do at the federal level. Having said that, though, there is a lot that should be done in order to right-size where the feds are. Title IX should be top of the list, of course, reversing the Biden administration's terrible encroachment that has made women's spaces and sports less secure. So that needs to be, and it will be, part of the day one agenda, certainly. But then I think taking a broader look, I mean, if we pull in higher ed to this, reversing so much of the Biden administration's efforts to cancel student loans, right? Don't even concede the word forgive. There's no such thing as forgiveness, right? You're simply taking from someone who either paid their loans back or made the wise decision not to go to college because it was a bad value proposition for them, or simply couldn't go to college, or maybe they put their lives on the line and entered the armed services in order to get the earned benefit of the GI Bill. You were taking from all of these people and giving to somebody who agreed, who signed on the dotted line to repay their student loans, and you're forcing them to pay off their loans. So that has to be, and I'm sure will be, part of the day one agenda, is reversing this terrible student loan cancellation policy that we keep seeing, right? The Biden administration has been smacked down time and again by the courts, including the Supreme Court, and now they're on, it's hard to keep track, but Plan C for student loan cancellation, right? They said Plan A is illegal. He moved forward with Plan B. That one's being sued right now. And now they're moving forward with Plan C to try to effectively accomplish what they wanted to that was already deemed illegal, giving out tens of thousands of dollars in student loan cancellation to people for, again, a completely unearned benefit. So that'll be part of the day one agenda. But just, I'll hand it back to you in a second, but just quickly, I mean, like I said, this is largely state-level policy, right? But the administration, in conjunction with a friendly Congress, hopefully, one of the biggest things that they could do would be to work to actually devolve programs and authority back to the state and local level. There's a proposal that's been sort of the long-standing conservative proposal for how to do that, known as A+, and that would allow states just to opt out, to take their share, remember it's just 8.5%, of federal education funding and put it toward any lawful education purpose under state law. And so then at that point, a state could use it to do whatever they wanted, advance education choice, prioritize reading, whatever it is that they want it to do. So you're basically block granting those dollars back to the state level.
Why do we even have the department to begin with? What was it created, and why shouldn't we have one?
Yeah. Well, I mean, it was a handout to the teachers' unions, to be honest, right? I mean, when Jimmy Carter was running for president, he made a promise to the teachers' unions that he would establish a cabinet-level agency for education prior to 1979, right? The department was signed into law with the Department of Education Organization Act in 79 and then went into effect in 1980. But prior to 79, education was just part of health, education, and welfare. It didn't have its own standalone agency. And so it hasn't been around since the beginning of time, right? I mean, it's just been around since 1980, which I realize is actually a while ago now, but not the beginning of time, right? So Carter made good on that promise and got a standalone agency, a cabinet-level department for education. Part of what Carter had said when he was pushing for the agency was that it will basically be more efficient than the current structure had been, right? Where you have all of these programs in disparate agencies, health, education, and welfare, that it would actually enable them to create more efficiencies. But that, of course, was not remotely the case, right? When we see the department created in 1980, they do hire a significant number of people right out of the gate, but now we're up to about 4,000 employees. When we looked at this about 15 years ago, honestly, was I think the last time I looked at it, the median salary was $103,000, so I'm sure it's far in excess of that at this point at the Department of Ed. But what matters is that the Department of Ed has created this parasitic relationship with the states where state education agencies, so the state departments of ed, have had to grow significantly in order to be responsive to all of the mandates and red tape that the federal Department of Ed hands down. So you get all of this administrative bloat. My colleague Jonathan Butcher looked at the salaries of state education agencies a few years back and found that about half, I think it was about 45%, of state education agency official salaries were federally paid salaries. So they're just this extension of the federal Department of Education. But we haven't gotten, obviously, the economies of scale that the Carter administration promised. Reagan came in, of course, a year later in 1980 and famously called it Carter's bureaucratic boondoggle, the Department of Ed, and that's exactly what it is. All we got was the infrastructure that has maintained federal intervention in education. We get more and more federal spending, more and more federal programs as a result of the department. And then you get this push throughout the 1990s for standards-based reform, right? All of a sudden, you hear people saying, well, we're spending all of this money at the federal level, we have all of these programs, we need some accountability for all of this money and spending. And so you see the federal government say to states, you have to have some sort of accountability structure in place. The Clinton administration pushed this through their Improving America's Schools Act. And then even prior to that, in 1989, there was a big conference in Charlottesville, Virginia, where all of the governors came and they said, we're going to set national education standards. And they weren't able to accomplish that, but it was sort of the backdrop for the Clinton administration's efforts to get states to adopt these reform plans. But it wasn't super prescriptive at that point. It was just states need to have some plan for reform. But if you fast forward to the George W. Bush administration, as you all know, famously, we get No Child Left Behind in 2001. And that was significant because with NCLB, the administration said, not only do you have to have a plan in place for improvement at the state level, but you have to demonstrate that students are making adequate yearly progress toward universal student proficiency by the 2013-14 school year. So that's AYP, the slang that's thrown around in the ed space. But not a single state was on path to make adequate yearly proficiency. And so No Child Left Behind had all these sanctions in it that would hit states if they didn't achieve it. So in comes the Obama administration. And the Obama administration says, oh, we see that you're chafing under the mandates of No Child Left Behind. We'll give you waivers. You can get out of it, but there's a catch. You have to adopt standards that are common to a significant number of states. And so Common Core, if you recall at the time, was the only standards that were sort of off-the-shelf standards that states could adopt. So we got 44 states right out of the gate that said, sure, we'll adopt national standards. And so you can see how much federal growth and involvement we had in the wake of the department.
So a beautiful history lesson, Lindsey. So let's dig deeper into that. Let's go back even further. In the paper, you talk a little bit about the federal intervention in education spheres, and you tie it to the war on poverty. Could you talk a little bit more about that?
I mean, that's really the genesis of federal intervention. I don't call it involvement, right? Don't even seed that word. It's federal intervention in education, right? Education is just simply not an enumerated power of the federal government. So it's federal intervention, and we see it really take off in 1965. So if you go back and you sort of read through the war on poverty that Lyndon Johnson launched in 65, every single aspect, nearly every single aspect of federal involvement in education, from preschool through higher education, started in 1965 with the War on Poverty and with the Great Society. And if you go back and you read Lyndon Johnson's speeches, you'll see he actually said 1/3 of the war on poverty would be fought in the classrooms of America. And he said, there your children's lives will be shaped. So he was very clear about it. And so in 65, we get the federal Head Start program, right? A federal daycare program. It started small, 500,000 kids. It was supposed to be a preschool program, but has turned into a daycare program that fails on every possible measure. It fails in terms of academic outcomes, kids' access to health care, their parents' parenting practices, their behavior. And this isn't just us sitting here saying it doesn't work. This is the Department of Health and Human Services' own randomized control trial evaluations of Head Start, demonstrating clearly that the program doesn't work. There's fraud. GAO found fraud. They sent undercover agents to Head Start centers around the country and found that Head Start administrators were actively counseling families to underreport their income so that they would appear eligible for services. So there's fraud. They found dangerous situations, tools left out that kids could get hurt on. So that's Head Start, hasn't worked. But in 65, we also get the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, which eventually became known as No Child Left Behind. Today is the Every Student Succeeds Act. And so that was and remains the largest federal education law. But effectively, all federal K-12 spending runs through that original Elementary and Secondary Education Act. There's also separately the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, but that's still the bulk of it. And then notably, we also get the Higher Education Act of 65. And this is where the federal government decides it's going to put the full faith and credit of Uncle Sam behind student loans. And they're still private at the time, but that changed very quickly too. I mean, you know now 93% of student loans are originated and serviced by the federal government. And so when you hear the Biden administration talk about student loan cancellation, we're talking about canceling the largest swath of student loans that are out there. And so none of this, whether it's Head Start, ESEA, or the HEA with higher ed, has led to better outcomes or lower prices. It, of course, has done exactly the opposite and inflated prices when it comes to higher ed. But yeah, 65 is really the genesis for all of it.
And also the latest pre-K experiment in Tennessee found negative effects by the end of 6th grade, winning a lottery to attend a pre-K. I mean, if you flip that, you can almost say that that means homeschooling has a positive effect. If you don't give your kid to Caesar a year early, they actually do better later on in life. But how about these, look, every time I get asked to go on Fox News, they want to talk about the campus protests lately. So what's going on with the Palestine protest on college campuses? Can you tell us a little bit more about that? Why do you think it's happening, and what should we do about it?
You're very polite calling them Palestine protests. I would call them like pro-Hamas riots, but that's fine. I mean, we still see it, right? I mean, even today, we're still seeing colleges deal with it, even though we're at the end of the semester, we're going into the summer. I think a lot of there are many explanations, right? Foreign funding could be among them. I think one explanation that often gets overlooked, right? If we assume a lot of these rioters are the same people who were demonstrating, say, in BLM riots over the summer, or a few years ago, kind of switched their focus. But a part of this, I think, is explained by the fact that college students just don't do anything during the day, right? And we know this because of the American Time Use Survey. We looked at American Time Use Survey data a few years ago, and American Time Use Survey is part of the Census Bureau's American Community Survey work. But it's really interesting because you can go in and you can look at how groups and individuals, it's self-report, but self-report that they spend their time. And so it's, as accurate as you could expect from that, but it's, a minute-by-minute log of how somebody says they spend their time. Well, from that data set, we were able to look at how college students report they spend their time. And on average, college students are working or going to class only 2.76 hours per day, 2 hours a day. So, and this counts all the time going to class, right? So it's everything. Going to class, it is, do they do work study? Their time studying. It takes into account, are you taking care of a family member? It takes everything into account. And so 22 hours of the day is leisure.
It's a 4 to 6 year party, right? That's the whole point of college.
Well, it's a good point, right? Because 60% of college students, if they finish, they're finishing in 6 years now. So this idea of graduating in 4 years is long gone. And so much of this leisure, so much of their ability to protest or whatever we want to call it, I think comes back to just too much time and too much subsidy, right? Like if you can get student loans and then have them paid off by the taxpayer, why not make bad choices?
So in K through 12, we had the Zoom moment with the teachers unions closing the schools. That backfired. With higher education, are we reaching a Zoom moment there as well with all the campus protests? I mean, in Brian Kaplan's book, he pointed out that we don't learn a lot of skills in college, but we still pay for the degree because of the signal to employers. Well, now a Columbia degree might mean you're going to disrupt the workplace. Do you think that's going to have a downward effect on what they can charge, and how do you think this plays out?
Hopefully, right? And I think that's a really interesting way to think about it. So Brian Kaplan's book, if you haven't read it, it's very good. I particularly commend the higher ed portion of his book. It came out a few years ago now, but excellent read. But he talks about the sheepskin effect in higher ed, where a degree, right, if you are going to a college and you're getting a degree, and let's say you plan on getting a bachelor's degree in economics, and you make it 3.99% of, or whatever, years of your 4 years, right? So you're going for 4 years, you make it 3.99 years, and I don't know, you break your leg that last day, something happens, you don't finish, right? All of that learning that has presumably taken place doesn't count for anything because you didn't graduate and you didn't get the paper credential, right? And so that's the sheepskin effect that Kaplan's describing, right? Is if you as an employer would look at that student, you wouldn't think, well, they finished 3.99 of their 4 years. They probably learned just as much as the guy who finished 4 years worth, but you didn't get that paper credential. The learning counts for nothing, right, when you're on the market shopping for a job. And so it's a fancy signaling device, an expensive signaling device. But I like how you're talking about what is it signaling now, right? If you go to Harvard.
You're a brat.
Right.
You're an entitled brat,
exactly.
and we're not going to hire you. And so hopefully it all burns down in a figurative sense. If the teachers unions are watching, they're going to put that all over the internet right now. But no, I'm the school choice evangelist, so let's talk school choice. Are there any federal proposals that you would support? What's the role for federal government, since we have a federal government involved in education? What would school choice look like?
Yeah, so there are different proposals that are out there. There is a proposal for a federal tax credit scholarship. What's the...
150 co-sponsors right now. Educational Choice for Children Act, Speaker Mike Johnson's on
exactly.
it.
So that's out there, right? And so that would be basically a tax credit scholarship that corporations and individuals could contribute. They would get a credit for their contribution, and then an eligible student would get a scholarship to attend a private school. That's out there. There are other proposals as well that we've been more focused on over the years. One is providing education choice to military-connected children. So if you go back to what I said earlier about education is just not an enumerated power of the federal government, true, national defense is. So there's a good argument to be made that the federal government is on solid ground providing education savings accounts to military-connected children. We did a good amount of work on this a few years ago. Everybody knows recruitment and retention is a serious issue in the military, right? I think I read something the other day that something like 36% of people are eligible to join the military, and that's because that's the universe of people who can pass the armed services qualification exam, are physically fit enough to join the military, don't have any other issues, joining mental or drugs or anything else, right? So the 36% of people who could do that. But that's of those who would be eligible. Even then, among those, something like 10% actually, want to join. So there's a serious issue with recruitment and retention. A couple of years ago, Military Times surveyed all of the military armed services, and they said, "Have you ever thought about leaving the military?" And 1/3 of respondents said they had, due to the public school their kid would have to attend at their next assigned duty station. And so you, as a parent, a military parent, you're getting assigned to your next duty station. Well, your child's also getting assigned to whatever government school is closest to your duty station. And for a lot of these families, that was a deal breaker. And so as a matter of national security, and as something that the federal government is on solid ground to do, provide these families with choices. Don't say you've got to send your kid to the public school that's attached to the base, right? Give them an ESA with that money instead and allow them to attend any school that fits their needs. So that's one. Similar, Native American students on tribal lands, there's a unique contractual history and obligation between the federal government and these tribal communities. That I think provides some solid ground for the feds to reform education for Native American kids. If you look, I know this sounds like a niche area, but it's interesting. If you look at the data on the worst performing schools in the country, it's Bureau of Indian Affairs schools. They are terrible. If you look at NAEP data, so often if you look at the breakdown of NAEP data by demographic group, these kids perform the worst of any group in the country. They perform 2 years. These are kids in Bureau of Indian Affairs schools. These are kids who perform 2 years behind their Native American peers in traditional public schools. They're awful. There's a school, it's the Havasupai School, but the Havasupai School, interestingly, is on the floor of the Grand Canyon. So it's just an interesting setup. My former colleague, Romina Baccia, who used to work at Heritage, an avid climber, she went out to the Grand Canyon to climb. I was like, you got to go to check out Havasupai and see what happens. So she goes to Havasupai to try to check it out. Doors are locked. It's 10 a.m. on a Thursday. She can't even get into the school. Nobody's there. Right? This wasn't, the middle of summer. It should have been open. So she walks around and starts talking to families, and they were fishing and just doing different things outside. And they said, yeah, if I send my kid to school, they're just going to pop in a video in the VCR and watch a Disney movie. Like, I'd rather have them out fishing and doing whatever. And again, this is a Bureau of Indian Affairs government-run school system. It's awful. These families who are, many of them, quite poor, they say send their kids up the rim. That's the lingo that they use, either by donkey or any other means that they can to get up to the rim, and then go 2 hours to a private school, a few of these families, to try to get something better. So let's provide them with options. And then the last thing I'd say on that, the DC Opportunity Scholarship Program, we should make that a universal ESA. DC, bad academic outcomes generally, but it is under the jurisdiction of Congress, so Congress can step in and make that a universal ESA.
And there's thousands of kids on that wait list every year, even though they get a third of what they spend in the government.
4 applicants for every available scholarship.
Yeah, so if it was all about money, they'd be flocking to the government schools, but they don't. They flock to the scholarships.
Or spending $30,000 a year in DC public schools.
So before we get to the end and move more towards K through 12, I'm going to ask what everybody's thinking in the room. So when Trump asked you to be education secretary, what do you think about that? And
I'd say, did Corey turn it down already?
I think you obviously know more about various policies within K through 12 and higher education.
In all seriousness,
I would have to kick it back to you.
There are some really great people out there. I'm excited just to see what transpires. We have a fantastic slate, and you can't say this often, but a fantastic slate of state-level superintendents right now that are about as conservative as you could get. We've got a great superintendent, and in Oklahoma, Ryan Walters, phenomenal. Just a well-rounded conservative superintendent that really has families' best interest at heart. So he's phenomenal. I love these superintendents who, even though their day job is the public school system in the state, they are doing everything they can to advance education options for families. Like, Ryan's one of those that gets it, right? Where Friedman said, yes, we'll publicly finance K-12, but separate the financing from the delivery of services and just allow families to take their share of public funding to whatever works for them. Like, Ryan gets it. Cade Brumley in Louisiana gets it. Great superintendent there. Ellen Weaver in South Carolina, fantastic superintendent. Yeah, South Carolina shout out.
She torched the teachers union boss in the primary.
Totally. It was great. Manny Diaz in Florida, fantastic commissioner. So we've got this really righteous group of superintendents, all of whom would be phenomenal.
I agree. Speaking of Oklahoma, they've passed universal school choice. So what's happening with the parent revolution at the K through 12 level?
Yeah, so Oklahoma's great, right? Because this is one of those more interesting stories where there's just the universal refundable use. Yeah.
The first
one
state
in the country
that's done that.
Yeah, and we actually, you heard it here first, but we have a 30-page paper coming out on whether that is kind of the next iteration of choice. We've all been saying for years, ESAs, and we're very much all still saying...
Could you explain really quickly just for the audience, what is a refundable tax credit?
Yeah, so everybody knows the education savings account model, right? If you think about a voucher, right, it's a coupon to go to a private school. That's great, but that's all it does, right? It does that thing really well, but that's all it does. An ESA is the refined version of the school voucher. You still use it to pay private school tuition, but you can also buy textbooks and pay for a private tutor and do online learning. You can roll over unused funds year to year. You can roll it into a college savings account. So it gets us much closer to aligning all of the incentives right for families to get a good product at a good price point. Refundable use tax credit, by contrast, would basically, in the Oklahoma model and the model that we're thinking about moving forward, if you think about a traditional tax credit scholarship where a corporation or an individual contributes to a nonprofit scholarship granting organization that then provides a scholarship to an eligible low-income child to attend a private school of choice, it's a great model because the money never goes through the hands of the government, right? It's a private foundation or a private individual giving to a private nonprofit scholarship granting organization, giving a private scholarship to a private individual child to attend a private school of choice. So the money never touches the hands of the government. So if you want to stay away from regulatory overreach, that's the way to go. And Corey and I have advocated for tax credit scholarship financed education savings accounts, but it's a mouthful and hard to say on a radio interview. But with refundable use, I mean, effectively, if you're income eligible, you're just getting that money straight back into your pocket. So that's great. Last thing I'd say, just because, I don't know, we talk about it all the time and why the incentives are aligned correctly with an ESA or a tax credit scholarship, but particularly with an ESA, the fact that you can roll over those unused dollars year to year, it really puts good pressure on both schools and families to shop around, to find a good product at a good price point, because you know you'll have money left over. And a lot of families recognize that as you go through the private school years, right, it can get more expensive to go from elementary to middle to high school. And so when Friedman first articulated this, and look, he came up with a modern-day school voucher concept in '55. He was still thinking about ESAs in 2006 when he did his interview in Ned Next, and he said, why not partial vouchers? This is sort of the first academic idea behind education savings accounts. But it always comes back, Friedman, and I don't even know what it was in, but he had put out, you've probably all seen it, but there are 4 ways you can spend money, right? You can spend your own money on yourself, your own money on somebody else's money on yourself, or somebody else's money on somebody else. And so public schools...
You got that down, don't you?
Yeah. Public schools spend money in that last category, right? Category 4 spending, Friedman called it, which is the worst way to spend money. You're spending somebody else's money on somebody else's children, so you have no incentive to economize or to maximize value. ESAs get us much closer to Category 1 spending, and you are spending your own money, right? It's your taxpayer money. There's no such thing as public money. You're spending your own money on your own children, so you have every incentive to economize and to maximize value.
So I wish Milton Friedman were alive today.
Because he would have endorsed your book.
Oh, there we go. Maybe, but I'll take Trump instead for now. But so why do you think, we only have a couple minutes, but why do you think this revolution has unfolded at the K through 12 level, where we now have 10 or 11 states, depending on how you count? We argue back and forth about whether it's 10 or 11.
It's 10.
It's 10 officially, but I'm an optimist, so 98% of the way there in Indiana, close enough. But how did we get here?
Yeah, so obviously COVID opened the window, right? But the reason we got such large-scale programs, right? We've got to reiterate it, 10 or 11 universal school choice programs. Universal. Every single kid in those 10 states is eligible for either a voucher or an ESA or tax credit. This is unbelievable. That number was 0 3 years ago, right? Not a single state. We would have, and we were, we were dancing on the rooftop. We got a universal program, and now we have 10. It is amazing. So we got there, yes, COVID definitely opened the window. It's cliche to even talk about it by now, but parents saw what their kids' public schools were teaching. They were wildly dissatisfied with what they saw. But we had laid the groundwork for decades to capitalize on that. And then I think in more recent years, and you can talk more about this than I can, but we leveraged what we've referred to now as the red state strategy. And to steal a line...
Chapter 4.
Yeah, Chapter 4 of Corey's book. But to steal a line from Corey, we got there by getting bipartisanship through hyperpartisanship. Where we basically made it attractive by pushing the states that would get it done on the right, and then making it politically palatable, to quote Friedman, for the wrong people to do the right thing.
We're looking at you, Daniel. Louisiana, where you at?
It's so close.
House passed it 72-32. Senate passed something different, 25-14, I think, the other day. But it's movement in the right direction. So hopefully Louisiana's number 12 or 11.
Sorry, Indiana. 97% doesn't cut it.
So I think we can open it up to questions. We're right on time. 4 seconds left.